We are continuing in the wilderness season of Exodus and chapter 17. We're going to start in verse number 8, and this two chapters we're going to cover are kind of broken up into two sections, but these two sections have three parts. So I'm going to invite you to stand as you are able for the reading of God's word. We'll read Exodus chapter 17, verse 8 through the end of the chapter, and we will jump right in. The word of God says, "Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. And so Moses said to Joshua, 'Choose for us men, and go out and fight with Amalek tomorrow. I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand.' And so Joshua did as Moses told him, and fought with Amalek. And while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill, whenever Moses held his hand, Israel prevailed. And whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and another on the other side, so his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. And the Lord said to Moses, 'Write this as a memorial in the book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven.' And Moses built an altar and called the name of it, 'The Lord is my banner,' saying, 'A hand upon the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation.'" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. We see first in this section the position of dependency. So this is Israel's first outside enemy since the Exodus of Egypt, that after they've come out of Egypt and have been wandering around in the wilderness, the enemy that they face have been themselves, that they've been grumbling, that they've been complaining, that they've been whining. There's not enough food, there's not enough water. It was so much better in Egypt. And after God has time after time proven to them that he will provide for them, even though they're grumbling, even though they're complaining, even though they aren't deserving of his kindness, God provides for them. And now, if Amalek isn't a name you're familiar with in the Bible, the Amalekites have a lineage that traces all the way back to Esau, the brother of Jacob, whom the Israelites are descendants of the great patriarch Jacob. And so the history between the Israelites and the Amalekites goes further back than just this story. We're not given tons of context here. We're really just given one sentence that says, Amalek came and he fought with Israel. That's all we get. But Moses, when he's looking back, so jumping ahead to the book of Deuteronomy, when he's recalling all the things that God has done, he says this in chapter 25, verses 17 and 18. "Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear God." The Amalekites were attacking those who were weary, those who were in the back of the group. Remember, there are millions of Israelites wandering along, and those who could not keep up traveled towards the back, most likely those who had some sort of illness, perhaps women with young children. And so this is not a good thing that Amalek is doing. And it adds that phrase, "he did not fear God," indicating that not only was this an unethical attack, it was an unrighteous attack. And so Moses calls on Joshua and he says to him, "Choose men and go out and fight." And he says, "Tomorrow I'm going to go stand on top of a hill with the staff of God in my hand." And we have to wonder if Joshua had any of the thoughts running through his head that you and I might have, like, Moses, you want me to take an army and go fight with swords, and you're going to go stand up on a hill with a stick? No way, I'm out. But Moses' future successor, Joshua, faithfully obeys without hesitation, giving us a glimpse into the future when very few people trust in Yahweh, and yet Joshua remains faithful in this wilderness season. Now, the whole focus of the scene is not really on the ground where Joshua is displaying extreme bravery and courage, but the focus is on what's going on the hill. That Moses stands up there with uplifted staff, the same staff that God used to part the sea, to bring water, to turn into a serpent when before Pharaoh, and his hands, that Moses' hands and his staff equaled the victory on the ground when they were up. So if they were up, they were winning, and as his hands lowered, the battle took a turn for the worse. And just to remember, this is a days-long battle that says it goes until the sun was setting. So it's not like Moses is up there for 5 minutes and the battle's done and he got a little tired. He's up there for hours on end. All of us would have very tired arms at this point. You might be wondering, like, what is going on up on this hill? Like, is it really just his hands and his staff are up? Like, we don't see God telling him to do that? What's going on? And the point is that this battle is not just a physical battle of power, but it's a spiritual battle of Yahweh's power. And while prayer is not specifically mentioned here in the text, it seems rather obvious that that's what's happening, and it was what's to be the connection between what is happening on the ground and what is happening on the hill. That as Moses' hands are up, he is praying, he is pleading, he is interceding on behalf of Israel, saying, we are fully dependent on you. Similarly, when we get frustrated, we throw our hands up. I did this yesterday. I was putting together some patio furniture, and it was not going very well, and I got very frustrated, and I threw my hands up and said, I'm taking a break. That it's the same thing here that Moses is saying, not I'm done with God, but I am fully dependent on God. My hands are up, pleading with God to work, to make good on his promises, to save his people, that he is in a position of pleading with God to work, that he is fully dependent on him. And Moses, understandably so, is unable to sustain this position by himself. His arms get tired as he is bearing the weight of pleading with God to save the Israelites from this battle. And yet we get this very beautiful picture of community as Aaron and Hur hold up his hands for him when he is no longer able to do it. That they helped Moses by bringing a stone for him to sit on and holding his hands steady until the going down of the sun. That Aaron and Hur provided the additional help that Moses needed in his intercessory role. That I love this scene in my mind of Moses' arms being raised and supported because he could not do it himself. His arms grew weary. And Moses trusted in Aaron and Hur to help and to assist, that as we depend on God to work, we also depend on other believers around us to help hold up our arms when we are too weak to carry on. This is beautiful, beautiful picture of what it looks like to live in the family of God, that when a brother or sister is struggling, we come alongside and help lift their arms up and plead to God on their behalf, asking God to work. That Moses didn't do it alone, that he sent Joshua, go fight this physical battle. And he took Aaron and Hur, and knowing his weakness, he doesn't push them away. He's like, no, I got this. I can do this. But instead, he lets his weakness be known and allows other people to minister to him. Just as we should allow brothers and sisters in our life to minister to us. That's where Galatians says we bear one another's burdens. We come alongside one another and care for one another. What we also need to remember about this is God is not surprised by what's going on in this passage. In fact, he's the one who's led them in the wilderness, that he knows all of these things. And part of the position of dependency isn't only worrying about ourselves, but worrying about other people around us. And we see that in these circumstances, we remember that God's presence transcends our circumstance, that although they are worrying about what's going on, God is with them, so they should not worry. And the effect of this hilltop prayer, this intercessory work that Moses, alongside the help of Aaron and Hur, is doing, is pointing out that we are so quick to forget. So at the end of it, it says, Moses, and this is verse 14, it says, write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua. Like, is Joshua really going to forget this battle that God gave them the victory in? Like, that Moses, by raising his hands and staffs and pleading to God, that God gave the victory? We'd think he wouldn't forget. But all of us, aren't we so quick to forget how God has worked in our lives? When we find ourselves in difficult situations and circumstances, we forget how God has worked in the past and we start to not trust him. Saying, I don't want you to forget this. I want you to memorialize this. And it says that Moses built an altar and he called it, the Lord is my banner. And this typical act of commemoration for events in life that were defining. So like for Moses to build the altar here and give it a name, like that's an important thing that Moses is doing. That it's meant to communicate a particular message, and therefore Moses says, the Lord Yahweh is my banner. And the Hebrew word and the use of it here in the ancient Near East had the idea of a signal pole, like a staff in the air so that people could see it from a distance. That it was something that troops could point to and say, that is where our hope and our comfort lies. That the pole would be raised off the ground, send a signal. We see this same word used in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 10, to point us to the Messiah, Jesus. It says, in the day, the root of Jesse, meaning the great descendant, Jesus, who will come from Jesse and from David, who shall stand as a signal for the people. Of him shall the people, of him shall the nations inquire. And his resting place shall be glorious. That for us now, looking back at the story of the scripture, we know we have a memorial, an altar, a signal pole that we can turn to find hope and comfort. And that's on the cross, that we remember the work of Jesus and what he did in dying in our place. And we can look to that as a signal of hope and comfort when we feel hopeless, when we find ourselves in these wilderness seasons. But here in the immediate context, Moses is simply making the point that while Israel was fighting the battle on the ground, it was really the Lord who was their rally cry. That he is giving victory to the Lord. Not saying, look at what we did. Look at what we did to the Amalekites. But no, look at what God did for us. That while they were fighting this battle, the battle truly belonged to the Lord. That their victory was dependent on God's help. That there's a direct connection between God's assistance and their success. And so this conflict with the Amalekites was part of the instruction of Israel regarding God's ability to be their provider. That he had proven his ability to provide for them by parting a path in the Red Sea for them to walk through when the Egyptians were coming to take them over. By giving them sweet water when there was no drinkable water around. By giving them manna from heaven. By giving them water from a rock. God has proven time and time again, I will provide for you. But now the people are to learn that even their battles, not their physical needs of food and water, but their battles are dependent on the Lord. That there are moments that we are called to trust in him and wait. There are other times where we're called to be like Joshua, where we're called to trust in him and go forth in the battle. That just as they needed God's help for everything, we need God's help. That there's this sense in the Bible that no matter what battle we're facing, there are divinely given means of grace and help. That the struggles which we may be engaged with may be difficult and scary, but we're not left on our own. That's why Moses had Aaron and Hur. That's why he was pleading to God, that he was dependent on other people and someone other than himself, meaning God, to trust in. That God gives us grace and help in our struggles. That's why we read, his grace is sufficient for you. And ultimately, we look and we trust that Jesus is the banner in which we trust in, because he provided the mercy by absorbing the judgment that you and I rightfully deserved, and that he pours out power when we face struggles in life. And the beauty of this passage is that whether the issues are battles within or battles outside, God is the greatest provision in himself. That whatever season we find ourselves, whatever struggles we find ourselves in, Jesus is the greatest provision for us. That we are to be in a position of dependency of saying, God, we need you to work. God, we are trusting you to work. But they continue in this season of the wilderness, and we're reintroduced to a character in just the next verse. Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law. And here we're going to see the testimony of dependency. So we're going to read just a couple of these verses. It says, Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. And now Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her home, along with her 2 sons. The name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. And the name of the other, Eleazar, for he said, the God of my father was my help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he encamped at the mountain of God. And when he had sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law, Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and your 2 sons with her. And Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. And they asked each other of the welfare, and they went into the tent. Then Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardships that had come upon them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced for all the good that the Lord had done, and how he had delivered them out of the hands of the Egyptians. And so, if you don't remember Jethro more, as Moses is killed an Egyptian, he's ran to Midian to escape for fear he is going to be put to death or thrown in prison. As he is wandering out there, he meets his soon-to-be wife and her father Jethro, and he becomes one of his shepherds, and he's in Midian for 40 years before God calls him to go back to Egypt to free Israel from the Egyptians. That Moses and the Israelites have made their way towards Mountain of God, which, to remind you, is where God promised when he appeared in the burning bush to Moses, I will bring you back to this mountain. This is that same mountain, God making good on that promise. And now there's a phrase in here that I want to draw your attention to. It says, all that God had done. It kind of brackets the section. First it's, and Jethro heard all that God had done. And then in that last verse, and Jethro rejoiced for all the good that God had done. So after greeting Jethro, Moses, he asks how he's doing, how are the flocks, how's the tribe in Midian. Moses launches directly into the incredible story of deliverance. That he tells Jethro everything. He doesn't hold back any details. He tells them all that the Lord has done for their sake because God has loved them. That he hits every high point of the supernatural punch that landed their warrior god Yahweh glory over the Egyptians, all the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, how God has time and time again provided for them. But he doesn't stop there. He also explains all the hardships that have come along the way, the bumps, the bruises, the constant whining of the people, the wandering in the wilderness. And he explains both the incredible deliverance and the real-world reality of the journey of following God out of slavery. But he emphasizes in here that God had delivered them, and he had delivered them from it all. So he's showing exactly the things that God has done from them. He's telling the whole story of God's rescue. Not just the good things, but also the bad things, the struggles, the wanderings. And we can't miss Jethro's response here in verses 9 through 12, where in verse 9 he rejoiced for all the good that the Lord had done for Israel. In verse 10 that he blessed the Lord who delivered you. Or verse 11 where he says, now I know the Lord is greater than all other gods. Or in verse 12 where he responds in worship, and he brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. That because of all of these elements of joy, of praise, of faith, in response to Moses' telling of the complete story of God's victory, I think it's clear that Jethro is one of the first examples in the Bible of a converted outsider, which points to the truth that God has been accomplishing his purpose. Remember at the beginning he said, I will make my name great among the nations. That Jethro is not an Israelite. That he is a priest of Midian, meaning like he is a worshiper of false gods. And now he is, after hearing the story of Yahweh and how he has worked, he has come to see that this God, Yahweh, is the one true God and deserves all of our praise and worship. That this is a man who puts his faith in God, in his works, in his deliverance. And it seems that Moses and Aaron and the elders agree with this perspective where it says in verse 12, they came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. That they had a communion meal in the presence of the Lord, welcoming Jethro in. And he's proclaimed, I am now a follower of Yahweh. And so hopefully the application here is clear to us that Exodus 18 is a call for us to share the gospel, that if you are a Christian in this room, the application for all of us is to tell the whole story of God's rescue in our lives. That we tell of the situation of where we were before Christ, where we were in bondage, enslaved to our sinful desires, devoid of any real satisfaction. We tell of the great news that Jesus came for us, that he died in our place to deliver us, and that we were raised that we might be forgiven, made perfect in the eyes of the Father because of Jesus' righteousness, not our own. That we tell of Jesus rising from the dead, showing us that there is a better life to come and promising a better future, and he will be there. But just as Moses did with Jethro, we can and we should also speak of the hardships as well. Meaning the hardships that come after following Jesus. That it's not all roses and butterflies immediately once you put your faith and trust in Jesus. That in fact, oftentimes your life here on earth is circumstantially harder before it gets better. That Christianity is not about being healthier, wealthier, and wiser. That it's not a real quick fix program. In fact, Jesus said to his followers, just so you know, you should expect rejection as they've rejected me. That in this world we're going to have trouble, but we also know that God promises to work all things, the highs and lows, the hardships and the good blessings, together for the good of those who love him. And we probably are all familiar, like, yes, we finish our benediction. We should go and we should tell people the gospel. Yeah, it makes sense. We should tell the whole story of Jesus and the work that he's done in our lives. And yet, here's the thing. In our busy, hurried, modern world we live in, we probably don't have the opportunity, like Moses, to monologue for 45 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, without context in the like Moses is telling him everything from the beginning of Exodus to now. I'm going to tell you the whole thing. We probably don't have those opportunities on a regular basis to share our whole stories. But remember that Moses lived with, or at least near Jethro, for 40 years in Midian prior to all of these events. That he's married to Jethro's daughter. And yes, we should tell the whole story. Don't hear me wrong, we should tell the whole story, but also recognize that sometimes telling the whole story takes time. It means we can't tell it all at once. And the point is that not that it's too hard to do, but we should do it, but we actually have to speak up and start telling our story so other people can hear it. It's been said by many different people that most ministry happens when ordinary people do ordinary things with gospel intentionality, and they watch as God gives them the growth. That even in our very ordinary lives of going to work, going to school, taking care of children, whatever it is that we do, even in our most ordinary of lives, with gospel intentionality, we can tell our stories to other people. We can live out our new stories for other people. And yet even that sometimes is hard. And I think it points to a deeper issue than just not knowing how to share the gospel or not knowing how to share our story. I think the problem is our allegiances are divided. Oftentimes we don't even know it, we don't even recognize it, that we fall prey to the worship of the approval of other people, wondering, what do they think of me? Where we find safety and comfort in knowing what people think of us. Think with me the last time that you could have shared the gospel with someone. You could have talked about Jesus with them, but you didn't. That feeling that you felt, that as you were walking away, this awkward sensation of like, should I tell them? Is this going to affect the relationship? The uncertainty of knowing what questions they're going to ask, how they're going to respond, the knowledge that they might think like, well, I think you're weird, or judgmental, or worse, you can fill in the blank of that emotion you were feeling. But listen to what the Bible tells us in Proverbs 29:25. It says that the fear of man lays a snare, but the one who trusts in the Lord is safe. And I tell you all this not because I do it perfectly. Far from it. It's a struggle. But at the end of the day, the approval of others might seem safe to us, but ultimately it's a trap. That it has no bottom, it has no foundation, because people are fickle. We may desire harmony and think it's a good thing, but harmony with our coworkers or our friends cannot save them, and it cannot save us. Jesus is the one who will come to judge the living and the dead. He is the one whose opinion ultimately matters. And so we need to recommit to telling the whole story of God's rescue, pointing other people to Christ, to the many relationships that you and I have scattered across the world. Whether in your home, your neighborhood, your work, your friends from college, that we need to recommit to telling the whole story and being less worried about what people think about us and more worried with being a faithful follower of Jesus. One last thing in this passage to mention before we move on that perhaps you're reminded of as I asked you to think about the last time you could have shared the gospel and you didn't. That there's encouragement here in this passage. That if we think back to Moses and Jethro's first interaction in Exodus chapter 4, that after God meets with Moses in the burning bush and lays out the entire rescue plan, he's like, hey, here are all the things that I'm going to do, Moses. Go back to Egypt, make it happen. Moses hears this and he goes to his father-in-law, shepherd boss, and he asks for some time off. I'm sure that Moses felt a little awkward at this point. I mean, no one else had seen the burning bush. Is anyone going to believe him that the God of the universe has put him on this special mission? Instead, Moses sheepishly says to Jethro, please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt to see whether they are still alive. He doesn't even mention that God's called him to bring them out. He's like, I just need to go and see if they're alive. He doesn't mention God. He doesn't mention the rescue plan. He doesn't mention the burning bush, and nothing happens. Jethro says, okay, go in peace. And I think it should be incredibly encouraging to us to see how God grows and matures Moses in the months ahead during this Exodus rescue, but also how God graciously gives Moses a second chance to tell all that God had done for him to Jethro. That he gets another opportunity, that sometimes we're like, oh, the moment passed, I'll never have another opportunity. But like Moses, we can pray and we can ask God, God, would you allow me another moment, another opportunity to tell someone the amazing rescue story that you've had in my life and how you desire to rescue them as well. That we are meant to tell the whole story. This is a testimony of dependence. Moses is saying, Jethro, look at me. Look at all the amazing things that I've done. Instead he says, no, look at Yahweh. Look at what he has done for me and for Israel. But that's not the end of Jethro. In fact, as we turn to this next section, this final section in chapter 18, we see that Moses' father-in-law, he's got some advice to give to Moses. You see the delegation of dependency. And so Exodus 18 continues with Moses' and Jethro's relationship, that Moses needs wisdom. Starting in verse 13. It says this, then the next day, so after Jethro becomes a follower of Yahweh and they celebrate and they're together, the next day Moses sat to judge the people. And the people stood around Moses from morning until evening. And when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, what is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone and all the people stand around you from morning to evening? And Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come. They come to me to inquire of God. And when they have a dispute, they come to me and I decide between one person and another, and I make known to them the statutes of God and his law. And Moses' father-in-law said, what you're doing is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for this thing that you are doing is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Now obey my voice, and I will give you advice, and God be with you. You shall represent the people before God and bring their cases to God. And you shall warn them about the statutes and the laws and make them known the way in which they must walk and what they must do. Moreover, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy and hate a bribe, and place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And let them judge the people at all times. Every great matter they shall bring to you, but any small matter they shall decide for themselves. So it'll be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this, God will direct you. You will be able to endure, and all this people will also go to their places in peace. As we know, and you can probably imagine even further, that this newly formed nation had their problems, they had their issues, that people are people, and people cause problems. And Moses needed help to maintain the unity and the peace, and so he'd sit from morning to evening, and they'd bring their disputes and their issues and their problems to him, and he would try to tell them and help them understand what to do. And Jethro observed this setup, and he asks Moses, why are you doing this? At one level, we can probably resonate with Moses, that Moses knew these people did not know the heart of God on practical matters, that Moses was the prophet upon the mantle of leadership had been divinely placed, and that Moses is working really hard to try and care for all the people and their needs, but it was deeply concerning to Jethro. That Jethro, despite even his newly found faith in Yahweh, has some important wisdom for Moses. He says in verse 17, "What you are doing is not good." For those of you who have in-laws, it's probably not the phrase you want to hear from them when they come and visit. "Hey, you're not doing that right. It's not how I would do it." He says, what you're doing is not good. You and the people will certainly wear yourselves out. This is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. And there are many practical points that we could make here that are just full of wisdom. Jethro is pointing out, like, Moses, you're not God. You have limitations. Remember, there are millions of Israelites that he could have sat there day after day after day and never get through all the problems of the people. It's like, Moses, you're not God. You can't do it. It is impossible. He's telling him that it's unwise and unsustainable for Moses to carry this heavy burden of hearing all of their problems, all of their issues, all of their conflicts, that it is physically weighing on him, and Jethro can observe the weight Moses is bearing. And it points out that Moses needs to find a way in which he could be most helpful to the people, that, hey, Moses, as much as you'd like to do everything for everyone, you simply can't do it. And he says, hey, Moses, you need to look for men of character. As you need to find men who love God, who won't take a bribe, who are trustworthy, and empower them to serve the people. Equip them for the work of the ministry. And lastly, he simply points out that a shared leadership model would create harmony and justice for Moses that he was longing for. That he's like, hey, listen, if you share the load, it'll be a good thing. You'll be able to continue. You're not going to burn out. You're not going to get so frustrated you can't do it anymore. This is a really important moment for Moses, that I imagine is not an easy one, that Moses is encountering this moment where the mission that he's been called to do and his ability don't line up. He's called to care for all these people, and yet he has limitations and cannot do all the work. That Moses, he wants justice for the people. He wants to teach them God's word. He wants to help them, and yet he cannot do it all on his own. And what Jethro is calling him to do is like release power, empower other people, trust in God to work in them, and trust in them to do the work. That Moses had to be willing to uncouple his sense of identity and value from his role as the only judge, to trust other people to do it. And we can think of a number of reasons that Moses could have given to reject Jethro's advice. Like, sorry, you've been here a day. You have no idea what you're talking. Like that, it's that. It says, and the next day. Like, Jethro, you've been here one day. You don't even know what I do. Could have said, you're not an Israelite. Only yesterday you were an outsider before you trusted in Yahweh. It's like, you don't know God's law. You know how complicated some of these issues are that the people are bringing before me. You'd be saying, the people are not ready. They're scared. They need to hear from me, their leader. Like any number of excuses could have been given, and even good reasons, as to why Jethro's advice could have been rejected. But Moses didn't allow those reasons to prevent him from listening to some really good advice. Now, there's really two things that we learn about Moses' character in this passage. Is one, that he's available, like he's made himself available to the people. But number two, that he is teachable, understanding his own lack, that he does not know anything, that he's now understanding, I can't do everything, that he is being teachable. That he could have allowed any number of self-centered objections to hinder him from considering a better path for himself and the people of Israel, but he listens. Verse 24 is the solution to it, and it says, and so Moses listened to the voice of his father-in-law, and he did all that he said. Moses chose able men out of all of Israel and made them heads over the people, chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, of tens, and they judged the people at all times. Any hard case they brought to Moses, but any small matter they decided themselves. And then Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went away to his own country. Proverbs gives us some more wisdom on this. Proverbs 12:15 says, the way of the fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. Proverbs 11:14, where there is no guidance, a people falls, but in an abundance of counselors there is safety. Proverbs 19:20, get all the advice and instruction you can, so you will be wise with the rest of your life. Moses gives us that example, that here he is, the man who met with God, who controlled the plagues, who parted the Red Sea, who made water come out of the rock, who did this victory over the Amalekites, and yet he still listens, that he's teachable. That Moses was not only ready for God's mission, he was ready to learn how to better do God's mission by delegating and trusting in other people. And we could finish there, like delegation is a very practical application point, that it is good to delegate. But in applying this, you can look at the type of people that Jethro says you should choose. He says, hey, you should choose men from all the people, men who fear God, men who are trustworthy, who hate a bribe. He's saying, hey, you should pick those among you who you can trust, who love God, who are going to seek to do his will. And a really practical application would be the importance of a plurality of qualified elders, those who meet the biblical qualifications in Acts 20 and 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, that there should be a high standard for those who lead the church, who care for God's people, but also that the elders are not to do everything, that they oversee the ministry of the church, but they also equip God's people to do the work of the ministry. So we read in Ephesians 4:11 through 16, that every member, every believer has an important role to play. And while some are appointed to leadership, every Christian has a part to play in the body of Christ. That every Christian is a priest, in the sense that we don't need to go to someone to have direct access to God. At the very minimum, we can pray for other believers. We can care for other believers. We can teach other believers. That we read in the scriptures that every Christian has a spiritual gift for the good of the body, for the edification of the church. That 1 Peter 4:10 says, as each has received a gift, meaning as every single one of you believers has received a gift, use it to serve one another. That we are to depend on one another, to trust one another, to care for one another. That what Jethro is pointing out to Moses and what Moses is pointing out to us in writing this is that we should delegate our burdens, our problems, our concerns to other believers who have access to God, the same as we do, but can help bear the load that we feel. Sometimes what that means is that we have to be really open and honest. That in telling the whole story, our whole stories to unbelievers sometimes means telling our whole stories to other believers of our struggles, of our shortcomings, of where we fail to pursue holiness. And that delegation of information requires trust. Like, what is this person going to do with the information that I share with them? But in the family of God, we should be the people who are most gracious, most caring, most concerned about people's burdens, because our greatest burden, our sin before God, has been dealt with. And as we've experienced such amazing grace, we should share that with others. That this delegation is hard. It's really hard. But it's better for us. Instead of trying to bear our burdens alone, like Moses is doing the burdens of all the people, share it with others so that others know what's going on, so that others can know how to pray for you, so others can know how to care for you. The call to Christianity is not a call to isolation, it's a call to community, it's a call to family, and family cares for one another. The main point of the second half of Exodus 17-18 is that we should have full dependency on God and dependency on other believers. That God gives us other believers to depend on, and ultimately we depend on Him and those He brings into our lives. Remember that in our wilderness season, God is fully aware of our circumstances, and yet we raise that banner up and we continually point to, the Lord is my banner in who I trust. And we point other believers to that same banner as we go.